I think the first thing around the India-China dyad one needs to think about is, and I don't think people realize this, particularly people in the West. We often talk about the sinking of the US-China relationship. Um, but even then, in this past few months, you've seen intense diplomacy between the two countries.
Mhm.
You've seen Blinken visiting, you've seen Janet Yellen visiting, you've got John Kerry right now in China, and you'll have the Commerce Secretary visiting soon. Um, and you had Xi Jinping and Biden meeting in Bali in November 2022. The last time that the Indian Prime Minister and Xi Jinping spoke one-on-one was in October 2019. The entire pandemic, there was no conversation between the two men. The only conversation that took place since then bilaterally was a brief 2-minute exchange in Bali during the festivities in the night, where the Indian Prime Minister went up to the Chinese president and they shook hands and they had a very brief exchange. This is happening at a time when both the countries are locked in essentially confrontation on the border. In 2020, there was the Chinese forces had sort of stepped over what was customarily believed to be India's line of actual control. And that led to a standoff in many domains. That led to eventually an aggressive fight breaking out in June 2020, with the death of 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese soldiers. This was the first time that you saw deaths on the boundary between India and China since 1947. Oh, sorry, not 1947, 1967. So it's a real, flashpoint that has opened up. And since then, the relationship has essentially nosedived. So in the India-China relationship is perhaps far more fragile today than any other bilateral relationship that China has. And again, it's two countries which have a disputed border. Now, within this context, if you place the competition that's taking place between the US and China, and India's own goals of wanting to strengthen itself because it has serious security concerns on the north with China and on the west with Pakistan, and it has serious security concerns in terms of its own growth and development, right? Serious strategic goals. It finds a much more able and willing partner in the United States today than it has found ever in its history. The India-US relationship for the last 20 odd years has been deepening. Ever since in 1998, the United States placed sanctions on India after India conducted its second nuclear test. And 2 years after that, Clinton visited India and the relationship started to change dramatically. So there's been an upward trajectory of that relationship. And today, that's on an accelerated path. And we have Xi Jinping to thank for that, because Chinese policies have facilitated a greater sort of strategic alignment between these two sides. So all of the things that we're hearing today about, India being an alternative to China, I think those are not new ideas in many ways, but they've been given new salience because of not just India's rapid growth, but also this sort of geopolitical environment, which, to be honest, Xi Jinping has facilitated. So a lot of us in India have to be very thankful to Xi Jinping for actually creating those conditions for India and opening those doors, which otherwise were opening, but they were far slower, in terms of how they was moving. And I think you can see that in the recent visit by the Indian Prime Minister to the US. When he was going to the US, I don't think anyone of us who were tracking this relationship, some of us in my organization, we'd argued that India should join the Artemis Accords and partner with the US on space. But it was not even on the agenda. But it was one of the biggest outcomes from the visit that India did sign on to the Artemis Accords. And next year, you're going to see an Indian astronaut going to the International Space Station with American astronauts. So I think that's an example of how rapidly the relationship is deepening. And again, it's a product of the strategic alignment. Now, if say China was to have a rethink of its ties with India and engage in some sort of outreach, try to pull back from the boundary, try to go back to negotiated agreements which had kept the peace for well over 30, 40 years. I think that what you will see from India is still continuing to deepening its partnership with the West, but it will remain cautious about aligning militarily. India has so far remained extremely cautious aligning militarily. The Quad is not a military alignment. I think India has been quite categorical that We don't want it to become a military alignment. Um, and Beijing believes that it is, drifting towards military alignment, because if you're building interoperability in other ways, the Quad just provides you a platform to actually leverage that interoperability. Um, so I think India will continue to remain very cautious of that because it wants to stabilize the relationship with China. Yet, I think this direction that we have embarked on in terms of our proximity to the West is unlikely to change. So it's a difficult balancing act for Delhi to perform, but it'll try to perform this in this manner, because at the end of the day, you can't change geography, you can't change your
Right.
neighbors. So you're going to be neighbors with China, until perhaps millions of years, until the continents drift again somewhere. So you're going to have to learn to live with each other. But that
And
doesn't mean that you don't grow and you don't secure yourself.